The Greek historian Herodotus, known also as the father of history, after his visit to Egypt some 2,500 years ago, describes how these amazing structures were built, and tells us that the Great Pyramid was built in only 20 years by the pharaoh Cheops, whose Egyptian name was Khufu. Herodotus further tells us in his histories, that the Great Pyramid was built as Khufu's eternal tomb. Unlike ancient Egyptian mastaba tombs, no official inscriptions have been found anywhere inside the Great Pyramid, or any other giant pyramids of this period. However, as we will see shortly in this documentary, some crudely painted marks were discovered in some hidden chambers deep inside the pyramid, and among these marks were the various names of the pharaoh, Khufu. Up until 1837, no one knew of these hidden chambers. The known interior chambers and passageways of the Great Pyramid before that time, look pretty much like the image here. Notice how the vaulted roof of the king's chamber rests almost just above the granite chamber ceiling, with just one small apartment in between. However, in 1837, this all changed when British antiquarian, Colonel Richard Howard Vyse, came to Egypt to explore the Great Pyramid, hoping to make some important discoveries. And it didn't take Colonel Vyse too long to make his mark. Using knowledge given to him by his ex-colleague, Giovanni Caviglia, the British colonel detected that there may be another chamber above the small apartment known as Davidson's Chamber. This small space was discovered in 1765, by the British consul to Algiers, Nathaniel Davison, and was named in his honor. Vyse went on to discover another 4 of these small apartments further up, naming each of them in turn after renowned British dignitaries. Upon the walls and roof blocks of these spaces, Vyse claimed to have discovered crudely painted marks that are believed to have been painted onto the stones, by the ancient workers who cut and transported the blocks to the pyramid. The most famous of these painted marks is a cartouche, in the topmost, Campbell's Chamber, which bears the royal name of Khufu. And so, with Khufu's name having been found in these sealed hidden chambers, Colonel Vyse had given to Egyptology solid evidence that the Great Pyramid had been built by Khufu, as his eternal tomb, just as Herodotus had said thousands of years before. During his time at Giza, Colonel Vyse kept a personal diary, his field notes detailing his daily exploits. These notes would later serve as the basis for the colonel's later book, Operations Carried Out at the Pyramids of Giza, which was published in 3 volumes in 1840, some 3 years after Vyse returned to England from Egypt. However, just a few years after publication of his Egyptian adventures, detailing his discoveries within the Great Pyramid, doubts began to be voiced over the colonel's claims, particularly with regards to the discovery of the painted marks bearing the name of Khufu. Between 1845 and 1847, a Prussian prince, Hermann von Puckler-Muskau, who had met Vyse at Giza in 1837, published an account of his own travels, and of his meeting with Colonel Vyse at the Great Pyramid. In these publications, the Prussian prince cast doubt over Vyse's claimed discovery of the painted marks, writing,
"The hieroglyphics which Major Vyse pretends to have just discovered in the Great Pyramid, are not cut in the stone, but merely drawn on the wall, and perhaps recently too, with a finger, dipped in color."
The accusation could not have been clearer. Prince Puckler-Muskau was accusing the British colonel of having perpetrated a hoax within the Great Pyramid. Curiously, however, there is no account of Vyse ever having refuted the Prussian prince's claim. And that is how matters remained for well over 100 years. However, in 1980, matters were about to take a significant turn. When researcher and international best-selling author, Zechariah Sitchin, independently came to the conclusion that Colonel Vyse had indeed perpetrated a fraud within the Great Pyramid by having 2 of his closest and most trusted assistants paint the king's name into the various chambers Vyse had blasted his way into. Sitchin's 2007 book, Journeys to the Mythical Past, presented further evidence of Vyse's fraudulent activities. Sitchin's research and conclusions were uncritically accepted and published by other leading revisionist authors of the time, including Graham Hancock, Alan Alford, and Robert Bauval. But the mainstream fight back soon arrived with the publication of the book, Giza, The Truth, by authors Ian Lawton and Chris Ogilvy Harold. This book analyzed in detail the Vyse forgery claims made by Zecharia Sitchin and found a number of major flaws in Sitchin's research. Indeed, so fatally flawed was Sitchin's work, that those authors who had formerly supported him, quickly backed away from the controversy, with author Graham Hancock even going as far as making a public retraction of his support for Sitchin's claim. And so, once again the matter seemed settled. The claim against Colonel Vyse of fraudulently placing Khufu's name inside these small chambers of the Great Pyramid had been comprehensively debunked. Or had it? In 2014, independent researcher and author, Scott Crichton, entered the debate, and later published his book, The Great Pyramid Hoax, which presented many items of evidence from a variety of sources that strongly supported the earlier fraud claim made by Zecharia Sitchin. Crichton suspected that if he could locate the private field notes of Colonel Vyse's time at Giza in 1837, then these notes, his private journal, might tell a different story to the official account the colonel had published in 1840. And so, with the help of the internet, Crichton was able to track down the location of Colonel Vyse's private field notes to a small archive centre in North London. Within the 600 pages of barely legible handwriting, Crichton would find several pages bearing information that contradicted the colonel's published account. 2 pages from Vyse's private notes initially caught Crichton's attention. These 2 pages appear to show that a fraud had indeed been perpetrated by the British explorer within the Great Pyramid in 1837, just as Puckler Muskow and Sitchin had claimed. The smoking gun to this fraud is revealed with a brief study of the Khufu cartouches Vyse drew on these 2 pages, the first on the 27th of May 1837 and the second on another page, 3 weeks later, around the 16th of June. Analyzing these cartouches in detail along with the notes Vyse placed in the page margin, Crichton uncovered some disturbing facts. An examination of the journal page from the 27th of May, when Colonel Vyse first enters Campbell's chamber, he draws on this page a representation of the Khufu cartouche he claims to have found there. In the enlarged image here we see something odd about the cartouche when compared with the actual painted cartouche in Campbell's chamber. In the small disc on the right side of the cartouche, Vyse has drawn 2 small dots instead of 3 horizontal lines. This might not seem like much, but what has to be remembered here is that these cartouches, the king's name, were highly significant discoveries, so it is reasonable to assume that Vyse would have taken great care to make a better representation of what he had supposedly just discovered. And that is precisely the point. Colonel Vyse was very meticulous and careful. We can see this by his drawing of the very small detail of the 2 dots under the cartouche snake sign. In drawing this very fine detail, we can see that Vyse was very much detail aware. Also, in his published account, Vyse writes that he examined this chamber minutely. Which raises the question: why then did he not draw the more visible detail of the 3 lines in the disc? One possibility for the absence of these 3 disc lines is that they simply were not present in the chamber cartouche at that time, but only added by Vyse at a later date. But what evidence do we have to support such a controversial claim? On this page of Vyse's private journal, from 15th to 17th of June, we find all sorts of curious entries. Again we have another contradictory drawing of the Khufu cartouche disc, along with what appear to be check marks, cross-reference marks, and other edit marks. It's almost as though Vyse had a change of mind about something, and was editing his entry on this page to reflect his new thinking. With all of the edits to this page, it almost seems as though something occurred between the date the Khufu cartouche was supposedly discovered on 27th of May, and the 16th of June, to cause this apparent indecision and deliberation we observe on this page of Vyse's private journal. Something must have happened that brought the colonel to investigate the spelling of this disc much more thoroughly, and to finally come to the conclusion that 3 lines needed to be added to the blank disc in order to correctly spell Khufu's name. So what happened? We will probably never know with any certainty the reason for the deliberation we observe in Vyse's journal entry of 16th June. However, it is known that around the 2nd of June, 5 days after Colonel Vyse had supposedly discovered the Khufu cartouche in Campbell's chamber, one of his assistants, John Perring, made a visit to a tomb which Vyse later called the Tomb of the Trades, which lay a short distance to the west of the Great Pyramid. Inside this tomb, Perring saw many hieroglyphic inscriptions, some of which included cartouches of Khufu. Representations of the cartouches Perring sent to Vyse from this tomb were presented in the second volume of Vyse's published work, and intriguingly, the woodcut drawings on the page show the discs in the Khufu cartouche were not blank, but had lines in the disc. Could the different spelling of the Khufu cartouche disc that Perring apparently found in this tomb have been the source of Vyse's 16th June dilemma? It is certainly possible, because, on the very day of his 16th June journal deliberations, we know that Vyse made a visit to this tomb. The colonel would have known at this time that the facsimile drawings of the painted marks he had appointed Mr. Hill to copy from each of the chambers were due to be sent by ship to London in a few days' time. This may then have been his motivation to visit the Tomb of the Trades at this time, his last chance to double-check the spelling of the Khufu cartouches that Mr. Perring had apparently seen in this tomb. If Vyse had placed the Khufu cartouche into Campbell's chamber with the spelling of Khufu's name incorrect, then this could have had serious consequences. Vyse may have felt he had to get the spelling of Khufu's name absolutely right, and consequently, went to the Tomb of the Trades to have the spelling double-checked, and, if necessary, changed before dispatching Mr. Hill's facsimile drawings to London where, for almost 200 years, they have been regarded as true representations of genuine painted markings made by the Great Pyramid builders. However, a close analysis of the Colonel's 16th June journal page raises the prospect that the cartouche we find in Campbell's chamber today may not be a genuine 4th dynasty artifact at all, but rather, as Prince Pukler Muskau claimed after meeting Vyse at Giza, a recent addition, placed there upon the instructions of Colonel Vyse himself. There are potentially many ways in which the journal entry of 16th June could be read, and naturally, some assumptions have to be made when interpreting such material. The interpretation of the journal entries which follows uses some logical deductions, together with the natural writing process, in order to reconstruct the writing entry sequence on this page. The material of interest is the hieroglyphic inscriptions, written on the top of this section of the main page, and also in the margin on the left. The first thing that requires to be established is what Vyse first placed on this section of the page. We see, for example, that a close analysis of the ink in this cartouche on the main page lies under the writing in the areas above and below the cartouche. This suggests that this inscription was written onto the page before the text above and the text below was present. We can further deduce information from the material Vyse has written in the left margin. Here he begins his entry of 16th June, followed by a few lines of writing, and then his entry of 17th of June, which takes up the remainder of the main page entry. Putting these entries together, we can easily deduce that the margin notes were also written before any of the main page text, since this text follows the contours of the margin text, suggesting the margin text existed beforehand. We now know that these two pieces of text were written onto the page before anything else. But which of these two entries came first? The hieroglyphic inscription on the main page, or the hieroglyphics and notes in the left margin? Before we consider this, it is worth mentioning here that in his published account of this day, Colonel Vyse made the following peculiar entry.
Nothing particular occurred.
The published entry of this date runs contrary to the Colonel's private account, which tells of a comparative study of the Khufu cartouche he had undertook at the Tomb of the Trades on this day. Of course, going to this tomb for the purposes of checking the spelling of a cartouche that had been placed within the Great Pyramid some weeks earlier, apparently with the incorrect spelling, would likely not have been in the Colonel's interests to make known in his published account. The proof of the Colonel's visit to this tomb, on the 16th of June, is presented in the left margin of this journal entry, where he writes,
Cartouches entombed to the west of the Great Pyramid are different to the Sufis.
The first thing to understand here is that the name Sufis is simply another Greek name for Khufu. This casual remark shows that the colonel, while on the ground at Giza in 1837, absolutely knew that the cartouche in Campbell's chamber was indeed that of the Great Pyramid builder. How Vyse had obtained such knowledge has never been established, although there is some evidence to suggest that the colonel had with him at the time a book by the Italian scholar Ippolito Rossellini, which clearly identified the cartouche of Sufis, the Great Pyramid builder we know today as Khufu. Secondly, this comment also confirms that Vyse did, in fact, make a visit to the tomb of the trades on this day. During his visit he draws some other cartouches from this tomb, which are seen at the top of the margin, and which the colonel would later reproduce in his published work. But the most important thing revealed here is the purpose of the colonel's visit to this tomb. With this comment, it seems evident that Vyse was undertaking a comparative study of the Khufu cartouches, most likely with the specific intention of checking the precise spelling of the cartouche disc. Given Vyse's inexperience with hieroglyphics, to undertake such a comparative study of such unfamiliar material would require that he did so, not from memory, but by taking with him an accurate sketch of the material that he wanted to check, and as much of it as he felt might be necessary for his study. There would be little point in taking with him a rough sketch of just one section of a particular inscription, when he might later find, at the tomb, that he actually needed a more accurate and fuller copy of the original inscription, which would then require a second visit to be made. Better to be fully prepared and take with him a copy of all the material that might be relevant, before going to the tomb to make his comparative study. Such a study would have been entirely self-defeating, if Vyse had taken with him to this tomb only a rough sketch of the Khufu cartouche in Campbell's chamber. Finally, Vyse's natural instinct would be to place his comparative sketch onto the first available space on the page, either at the top of the main page here, or perhaps at the top of the margin. It is highly unlikely that he would place his comparative sketch at the foot of the margin. All of this suggests that the inscription labeled
"In Campbell's chamber"
on the main page was the sketch that Vyse drew and took with him to the tomb of the trades on the 16th of June for the purposes of his comparative study. This text is more complete and has been written in the first available space at the top of the main page, as opposed to the bottom left margin of the page. The next thing Vyse does on this page is to place a small cross or check mark just above the blank cartouche disc, indicating that this blank disc is the sign he specifically wishes to check when he is at the tomb of the trades. This sketch, being the colonel's comparative sketch to take with him to the tomb, requires that it would be an exact copy of the actual cartouche and disc that was in Campbell's chamber at that time. As previously stated, it would entirely defeat the purpose of a comparative study if the comparative text was itself inaccurate. In the tomb, Vyse notices that the cartouches there are different to the Sufis, and draws some of these cartouches in the top margin area of his journal page. From the drawings here, and from modern photographs from this tomb, it appears that there are indeed many Khufu cartouches in this tomb, and also in adjacent tombs, bearing only the blank disc. However, Vyse then draws in the page margin a disc that has 3 lines within it. The drawing of this lined disc suggests that Vyse, just like Mr. Paring before him, found a Khufu cartouche in this tomb, or perhaps an adjacent tomb, that presented lines in the disc. At this stage, the colonel makes an enlarged drawing of his comparative sketch cartouche from the main page, and places this enlarged copy into the empty space at the foot of the margin, ensuring also to copy the blank disc and the cross-check mark. Having done this, he then places a cross through the base of this enlarged cartouche, deciding it seems that it is wrong. Specifically, he places another line through the cross-check marks of each of the cartouches, perhaps now indicating that the blank disc itself is the sign within the cartouche that is wrong, and which needs to be changed. It seems at this stage that Colonel Vyse has decided that the disc with the 3 lines that he and Mr. Paring apparently observed at the tomb of the trades, or perhaps in some other adjacent tomb, should be inserted into the blank disc of his enlarged margin drawing of the Khufu cartouche. Having inserted the lined disc into the blank disc, Vyse then cross-references the change by placing a small vertical stroke just to the right of each of the discs. This may then explain why the disc in the enlarged margin cartouche is the only disc on this page that presents a double outline. It is a disc within a disc. And finally, having made the necessary change, Vyse writes below the modified cartouche.
Cartouche in Campbell's chamber.
And below this he places 2 vertical strokes, perhaps indicating that this revised cartouche is a second revision, or Mark II, of the cartouche he had previously placed within Campbell's chamber. Having made his edits to the Khufu cartouche on this page, Vyse would then have completed the journal entry of the 16th and 17th of June. He would likely then have instructed his closest assistants, Mr. Raven and Mr. Hill, to add 3 lines to the disc within Mr. Hill's facsimile drawing before it was sent to London, and also, to the Khufu cartouche in Campbell's chamber, which is how we see this cartouche to this very day.
The information in this video is based upon research by author Scott Crichton. These books are available from the publisher, Inner Traditions, Bear and Company, online at Amazon.com, and from all good bookstores.